our live panel discussion at the end of our week on global Englishes and at the end of the whole course. I'd like to introduce the three of us. First of all, myself, Jennifer Jenkins. I'm Professor of Global Englishes here in the University of Southampton and Director of our Centre for Global Englishes. I'll be chairing this panel discussion, and I'll be joined by my two colleagues, Ing and Will. So I'd like them to introduce themselves. So over to Ing.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ing. Now I'm a lecturer at University of Southampton, and actually, like many of you, I first developed my interest in the concept of English as a lingua franca while I was doing my master's degree, and Jenny was teaching on that program. Then I followed her and I did my PhD project. Then I was a founding member of Center for Global Englishes, and I helped with the establishment of that center. Then I got 2 years lectureship in China. Then I come back to Southampton, and now I'm working to teach global Englishes at this university. Okay, over to Will.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm Will Baker, and I'm also a lecturer at the University of Southampton, and I'm the convener for the MA program in Global Englishes, and also the convener for the MA in ELT online as well. So I've been at Southampton for about 10 years now, and I did my PhD here before becoming a lecturer. And before that, I was an English language teacher for about 12 years in the UK and in Thailand. So my interest is in both teaching and in research. Okay, I think back to Jenny with the first questions.
Hello again. Well, just to say that Kate will be sending me comments from the chat window, so keep sending them in. But to get us started, we're going to answer some questions that we've already had. And we'll start with questions about issues to do with native and non-native English speakers. And we've had questions asking whether native English speakers should have higher status than non-native English speakers, and what's the value of having a non-native English speaker teaching you. And one very specific question was from Sardar, which was, suppose there are two teachers, both professionally sound, but one is a native speaker, whereas the other is a non-native speaker of English. Who will be the best one then? Of course, the native speaker will be the best. Am I correct? So I think we'll go over to Ing and ask her to start by talking about these questions.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And actually, I think native English speakers might have advantages at the moment. I mean, this is the current situation. But I mean, this might be not an easy answer. Actually, I mean, this it really depends on what the employer looks for in English teachers, and it really depends on what subject you are talking about. And actually, just like myself, actually there are many non-native English-speaking lecturers in University of Southampton, and actually where I was teaching in China, and I don't think native English speakers have the advantage in terms of many subjects that we were teaching to students. So actually, I mean, the ideology is like that native English speakers is much better than non-native English speakers, but this is not always the situation. And yeah, I really think this is an ideological thing. Yeah. So yeah, we'll add something.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I agree with what Ing has just been saying, and I think perhaps sometimes the native non-native distinction is unhelpful. I mean, what people are often looking for are effective teachers, and effective teachers can be either native or non-native speakers of English. I mean, I think there are various criteria or sets of proficiencies or sets of competencies that teachers need, but I don't think nativeness in itself should actually be a criteria for that. Obviously, proficiency in the language is important, but just as important as being an effective teacher, having proficiency at teaching. So I think Ying is right. A lot of the kind of discussion around who's best, native or non-native speakers, is really to do with people's kind of attitudes, ideologies, beliefs, and not really about effective teaching. And actually, I think if you ask students what they want is a good teacher. They don't really care whether it's a native or a non-native speaker. I don't know if Jenny wants to add anything there.
Well, I just had a brief, it's a little anecdote really, that one of my PhD students told me. He was here working on our pre-sessional English program last summer, and he was teaching alongside, he's from Syria, and he was teaching alongside two teachers who are native English speakers, two British teachers. And at the end of the course, one of the British teachers asked the students which teacher they had which teacher they felt had been best. I don't know if he actually used the word best, but which teacher they had preferred, and they all said the Syrian one. So clearly a large group of students learning English for academic purposes had found that they learnt more from a non-native English speaker teaching them than from the two native English speakers. I think there are many, many reasons for that, but I mean, Ying has already told us some of them, Will has told us some of them. But you know, you often do hear that students say they do find other non-native English speaking teachers easier to understand, having more understanding themselves of what it is that the learners are going through. Does anyone want to say any more about that question, or shall we move on?
Can I just add one point to that? Yeah, I mean, I think an important thing is it can be a problem distinguishing between native and non-native speakers. As I said, I think effective teacher is the thing that people are looking for. But I think it is important that native speakers, if they are going to be teachers, are not monolingual. I mean, I think that really is a problem. To be an effective teacher, you must have experience of learning and teaching learning other languages. Otherwise, I think it's very hard to empathise with what learners are going through, which is why, as Jenny is saying, often non-native speakers make the most effective teachers because they understand what their students are going through.
And it is a current irony that a very large number of native English-speaking teachers of English are, in fact, monolingual.
Exactly.
And are able to get jobs very easily all around the world. We may come to this in another question, in fact, but they're very easily able to get jobs because the main criterion for those jobs is being a native English speaker, even if they're not allowed to say that anymore in some adverts for jobs. They find a way of saying it by referring to specific qualifications and so on. But it is still a situation where native English speakers who are monolingual, who have no idea of what the difficulty is in learning to speak another language well, are able to get the jobs over the people who happen to be non-native English speakers. Is that it, or shall we move on?
Yeah, can I just one point to add? Yeah, actually, what I was going to say is, so actually at the moment we see this ideology, native English speakers have more advantages than non-native English speakers, but actually I think as non-native English speakers, it's important that for us to realize and to acknowledge the value of non-native English speakers on English. I mean, not to reinforce the ideology, but it's really important to feel confident in your own English and to feel confident in your own competence in in your disciplines, in your subjects, so that I mean, it's really an attitudinal thing. You should, I mean, to start to challenge. Otherwise, there won't be any change. So this is the point that I really, really want to make as a non-native English speaker. Okay.
Okay, I think we have finished with that one now, so let's move on to the next. And several people have asked questions about English language standards. So one person asked about what levels of English would be necessary for airline pilots and for air traffic controllers. Another one, Gemma, asked, what about university study? Is ELF sufficient to study in English medium in a university? So I'm going to hand over to Will to start us on this one.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that's a very good question. And I think there are perhaps three different ways of looking at this. There's, of course, the idea of standard, so what is a standard English? Then there's the idea of native English. Now, native English is not necessarily the same as standard English. There are plenty of native speakers of English who do not speak what would be considered as standard English. Yeah, I'm sure everyone's familiar with their own language. There are lots of dialects, there are lots of varieties of language, and that's even more the case with English than many other languages due to the huge reach of English. So native English and standard English are not actually the same thing. Then, of course, there's the issue of whether what we actually want is standard English or whether we want intelligible English. Now, I think some of the areas where you've been discussing, for example, airline pilots, what you want is intelligible English. I mean, the most important thing is that the air traffic controller and the pilots can understand each other. Yep, so when people are coming in to land a plane, they understand the instructions. And really, the people doing that don't care what kind of English you use, as long as they can understand your English. So their intelligibility is the key issue. Now, there is actually some research on this. I won't quote it now, but we can perhaps follow up on this afterwards. But it shows that native speakers are not necessarily the clearest people at all. That actually using things like colloquialisms, idioms, your own kind of dialect version of English is not very helpful. That there are actually certain features that are perhaps more easy to understand than others. Certain features of pronunciation, certain vocabulary items, certain grammatical structures that might be easier to understand. And that's really an issue of intelligibility more than standard English, and it's certainly not native speaker English. So I think people are quite right to say we need to have a kind of English that air traffic controllers can understand. We need to have a kind of English that's acceptable as academic English, but we need to separate that from the idea of nativeness. There will be certain criteria of intelligibility or appropriateness, and that's how we should be looking at these things.
And if I can come in briefly, just it's not really an anecdote this time, but as far as the air speak goes, one of the things in British English or an American English that is not allowed any longer is the sound th, the th sound th, because it's so often not understood. And instead, I think it's 1, 2, 3. They actually have to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rather than 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5. But to go on to, are you going to talk about Gemma's question on universities, Will, or shall I go on?
Would you want to start on it, and then maybe I'll add something?
Okay. So, yes, the university situation is quite a complicated one. We're talking, of course, about universities where there are students who are not native English speakers. There are so-called international students if they're in Britain and the US and Australia. And therefore, we're talking about environments that are basically English lingua franca environments, where a lot of the people who are present, and increasingly staff as well as students, are speaking other kinds of English than native English. And somehow, if the university wants to call itself international, and very many universities these days do advertise themselves as being international or even global, it seems very strange that they then insist on just one of 2 different kinds of native English, either British or American. It just somehow doesn't seem quite right that they can then be international, because being international means that you're accepting that your university engages in intercultural communication on a daily basis, and sometimes even the majority of students in a group, in a class, in a year, will actually be non-native English speakers. I've been told of situations where there may be 100 students on a master's program, and 95 of them are non-native English speakers, and yet they're still expected to use the kind of English used by the 5 British students. Somehow, linguistically, this is wrong, and it seems to me that much more important would be the ability to, the same as Will talked about with the airspeak, to be mutually intelligible. And to make yourself easily understood, whether you're a student or a lecturer, rather than just all trying to mimic one particular kind of English. And this is where really intercultural communication is absolutely crucial. And I think at this point I'd probably hand over to Will, because this is his special area.
Yeah, I mean, picking up on the intercultural communication point, I mean, lots of successful communication is not just about linguistic features, of course. So, there are lots of intercultural communication skills to do with pragmatic skills, so how you use the language, understanding of different ways of using the language, different cultural practices, so what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's considered polite, what's not polite. So actually, if what we're really interested in is people communicating effectively, which often we are interested in, then we need to look at a much wider range of skills, of knowledge, of attitudes than just things associated with particular grammatical structures or particular phonological features. So I think perhaps we need to broaden out our understanding of what it means to communicate effectively. And I think that's as important in academia as it is in business, as it is in air traffic control or any of the other areas we're talking about. I don't know if you want to add anything here?
Yeah, I'm just very interested in the notion of levels of English, and is ELF sufficient? So actually, it seems to me that it's also an ideological issue. So what level do you think ELF is? So, I mean, there is always a hierarchy of different Englishes. So like native speakers English, that's good English. Then second level possibly be our circle speakers Englishes, and then that is the English used by people who are from expanding circle countries, or people who are from like China, Japan, Germany, France, where English is only used by those speakers for the purpose of intercultural communication. So actually here we seem to see a hierarchy of different Englishes. So actually I'm very interested in, the notion of levels of English, and is ELF sufficient? So actually I think the point that Will and Jenny have already made is really ELF is not just a kind of English. ELF is focused on the functional use of English. Is what I'd like to say is more like lens through which we can see how we can perform our purpose, how we can perform the function of English very well. It's not like ELF is a particular kind of English which is less good than other Englishes. So actually I think possibly, when you talk about levels of English, and ELF is not, is it sufficient? This question might be ideological. So actually, yeah, this is the point that I'm making. Or possibly when you have gone through this program, MA Global English, is possibly you have different questions. So possibly, for me, I've already done the course, and I got PhD degree, and I don't think this was an issue. I was thinking about this question before, but at the moment, I think this is really an ideological issue. So that's all for me.
Okay, and of course, as I think we've said many times in all the various video recordings for this week, ELF isn't a variety. There is no one version of ELF. So ELF is used in many, many ways. ELF is about English being used as a lingua franca, and you can have people who are extremely effective at it and people who are extremely ineffective at it. So if we want to talk about levels, I think we should be talking about who is an effective ELF user and who is not. And actually, you often find that the least effective are native English speakers who are not able to adjust to intercultural communication context, because they do the sorts of things that Will was talking about, use a lot of local idioms, don't realise that actually a lot of people who didn't grow up in this native English British culture, for example, don't know those idioms, even though they're very effective users of English, users of ELF. And in fact, we find this in the international university setting, where lecturers who are probably monolingual English speakers use lots and lots of idiomatic language and local reference in their lectures. And of course, the students tell jokes. And another thing that has come up in my own research a lot is how the lecturers tell jokes that only the native English students can understand. So this is not effective use of ELF or even of English, because you're talking to people, and many of whom don't understand what you're saying. So on any level, that would be bad English, as far as I'm concerned. Just one other thing I want to say, because Ying has referred to the outer circle and the expanding circle. There may be people among you who aren't sure what those are, but very often the world has been divided linguistically into the inner circle, which is the mother tongue English speakers, the outer circle, which is made up of speakers in the post-colonial countries, the countries that were once colonized by the British, such as India and Sri Lanka, Nigeria, and so on. And then the expanding circle, which is basically the rest of the world, all the countries where people learn and use or use English for, often for intercultural communication, but have never been colonized and often don't use it with each other together. So that's what we mean. If those terms should come out at any point, that's what we mean by them. But now we're on ELF. I think we'll stay with ELF because we had, as you can imagine, we had lots of questions about ELF. And I'll start with one from Kelly, which is about the purpose of ELF. Actually, lots of people asked about this. But Kelly asked, why was ELF created in the first place? Why didn't we just stick to teaching and spreading EFL language learning and standards throughout the world? And I'd like to start with this because it relates to the recording that I made, which was called Interview with an ELF Researcher. And I talked in that about how I first became interested in ELF. And the whole point was, ELF wasn't created, ELF was there. I was just observing something that I was seeing around me. I was surrounded every day by non-native English speakers from different places, and I was observing what happened when they communicated very effectively with each other. And because I got very interested in that, I started doing some research on it. But ELF has existed for centuries. I mean, even if we go back, 200 or 300 years, there have always been times when English has been used as a lingua franca among people from different languages. So nobody created it, it arose itself. So to answer that first question, why was it created in the first place? Well, it wasn't. It happened. Why don't we stick to teaching and spreading EFL language learning and standards throughout the world? I think I'm going to pass over to Will and Ying. I don't know who would like to take that one.
Everyone should go first.
Nobody? I mean...
Okay, yeah, I'll go first, shall I?
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, I think, I'll take up on the EFL part of it. So, I mean, I think we need to think about what we mean by EFL. And if it means English as a foreign language, as in it's looking at a model of non-native speakers communicating with native speakers of English, then I think a moment's reflection will show up the problem with that. I mean, what ELF research and World English's research and Global English's research has shown is that the majority of English use is non-native speakers of English talking to other non-native speakers of English. So to then have teaching of English based around a model of native speakers communicating with non-native speakers seems slightly odd, because that's clearly not what most people are going to be using English for. So we'd question, I would question what's the rationale for that model? Why would you want to teach that model? Now, of course, there may be scenarios where people are learning English because they want to go to the United States or the UK or Australia or wherever and communicate just with native speakers of English. But I think that's really going to be a minority of people who are learning English. I mean, even the majority of people who learn English perhaps to come and study in a university in the UK or the US, as Jenny was saying, in those countries, universities are very international. The majority of people they're going to be interacting with are going to be people who are using English as a lingua franca. So again, there's no real justification for this model of native speaker to non-native speaker English. So I think for the majority of people who are learning English, what they actually are looking at is an ELF use of English rather than a native to non-native or an EFL use of English. I don't know whether you'd agree with that, Ian.
Yeah, I agree with you, of course. And actually, I think the point that Jenny made is that ELF is always there. It's not, something created by somebody. And actually, this is just a phenomenon. And possibly, I think, for native English speakers, this is something that they need to learn. Actually, this is not my point. A point made by both Jennifer Jenkins and Barbara Sathoff in their in their papers, and they said native English speakers should also learn to adapt their way of using English in order to make their communication with non-native English speakers smoother or easier. And actually, yeah, this is true. I have met some non-native English speakers who complained with me that yes, native speakers' English are really difficult to understand, while English between me and other non-native English speakers might be easier. So actually, yeah, possibly I think for non-native English speakers, this concept might be more accessible. But for native English speakers, yeah, they need to adapt their way. I mean, ELF is not native speakers' English, so there's something different from the English that has been generated in the monolingual native English speakers context. So actually, I think for native English speakers, this might be a big challenge. But for non-native English speakers, I mean, because of the ideology goes like their English is the English. So yeah, this makes people might make people think ELF is a new phenomenon, but actually this is a phenomenon. But what we are talking about is a new concept. How can we conceptualize the English phenomenon today in the context of English globalization, which features more non-native English users than native English users? So yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm just echoing, yeah, Jenny and Will's point. It's nothing new. It's there, but what is new is our perspectives. How can we interpret? How can we understand this phenomenon in a more in a different perspective, which actually sees native English speakers English and non-native English speakers on equal footing. So yeah, that's my point. Okay.
Okay. In relation to some of the things that Ian has just been saying, we've had a very interesting question that's come in from Penelope, which says, should we teach accommodation skills to native speakers of English? I'd like to just say something about that myself, because a research project I did fairly recently involved interviewing 34 non-native speaking students in one university about their experiences, and several of them said that they thought while they were doing their English language pre-sessional course, the home students, the native English speaking students, should be doing a course in intercultural communication, learning how to communicate with international students, people who are not British students. And several of them mentioned this, and most of them mentioned that they found that the home students didn't know how to adjust the way they speak in any sense. So accommodation means that you just adjust the way you speak according to who you're speaking with. And it seemed to me that the students felt, these non-native English students felt that they communicated very well with each other. They got used to each other's way of speaking very quickly, and they learnt they could adjust very easily, but it was the home students that had the problem. But I'd like to hand over to Will and Ian to see if they want to add anything on accommodation for native English speakers.
Yeah, I mean, I think accommodation is crucial, and perhaps the most crucial skill actually in effective communication. I mean, we were talking earlier on about intercultural communication, and obviously English as a lingua franca communication is intercultural communication. And in my own research, I've looked at how people who use English as a lingua franca, what kinds of skills and what kinds of knowledge they make use of to communicate effectively. And linguistic knowledge is just one part of it. Now, clearly it's an important part, but it really is only just one part. It's just as important to have knowledge of different kinds of social practices, so different ways of greeting people, different ways of starting or finishing conversations, different ways of turn taking, or different ways of agreeing, disagreeing with people. And being able to adjust the way you do that is crucial. If people are very kind of fixed on one particular way of doing something, then they're going to be very unsuccessful intercultural communicators. And I think that's one of the problems with or can be one of the problems with English, in that native speakers of English perhaps feel that they're just communicating using their language the way they normally use their language, the way they would use it perhaps at home, or the way they've grown up using it. But in any kind of international environment, they're using English as a lingua franca, as a medium of intercultural communication. And as Jenny was saying from her students, the ones who are non-native speakers of English are aware that they're in an intercultural environment, and they're adjusting themselves, they're being flexible, they're expecting to have to explain things, not assuming that people instantly understand what they're talking about. And I think maybe one of the problems that native speakers have is that they don't really think that actually they're in an international environment where when they're using English, they're not using it with people who come from a shared background, they've grown up in different cultures, and that they need to be flexible in the way they use language, they need to be flexible in their understanding of the way other people use language. And I think there's a whole set of skills and knowledge associated with that, which, I mean, I don't want to talk about English language teaching now, but I think is unfortunately often absent from English language teaching. That we focus so much on linguistic features that we forget many of the other crucial features of intercultural communication.
Ian, do you want to add?
Yeah, actually, I think Will has gave a very detailed explanation of this accommodation process, which is very useful and important for successful intercultural communication. What I'm going to add is just one point where Will talked about this intercultural communication at micro level. I'd like to just to say it in a very general perspective. And I mean, this is just a point made by, actually it's not by, in the literature, that is the ownership of English. So non-native English speakers actually appropriate English, which was generated in the context of English, of native English speakers context. So they actually appropriate their English to make it suitable for their own purposes of communication, identity projection. So actually in this process of appropriation, they are making English their own. So actually this actually echoes the point that is it possible to create a form of English for non-native English speakers. So actually, while non-native English speakers are using English in their way successfully, they are appropriating it and they are making English their own. So actually, this links to the point of the ownership of English, which was actually which is in discussion in the literature. There's a lot of a debate, a lot of discussion and debate on this notion, the ownership of English. So yeah, I think yeah, that's from me.
Okay, Will said a moment ago that he wasn't going to talk about teaching, but I think maybe we should talk about teaching, actually. We had a question from Isabel about teaching ELF, and she wanted to know if there's a difference in teaching ELF instead of EFL, and are there any places in which native English teachers are teaching ELF instead of EFL? How can a teacher decide which is the best? So, I mean, how can we, is there any teaching of ELF actually going on? And how could we decide whether that's better for students or whether EFL, traditional English as a foreign language, is better? I don't know if you want to start, Will.
Okay, yes, thanks. Well, I think, as I said before, we need to think why we're teaching English, and for most people we're teaching English for English as a lingua franca communication, not for EFL communication. So clearly the rationale behind English would be more to do with English as a lingua franca. Are people teaching ELF? Well, I think you could ask the same question, are people teaching EFL? I mean, the way people teach is very various and very varied, and there's lots of diverse settings of English language teaching, so I wouldn't like to make a generalization to all different teaching contexts. But certainly I think many people, when they teach English, they're not teaching English like a native speaker would use English. They're not teaching maybe a particular standard of English. They're often adapting materials for their own uses and things like that. And all of that would actually fit in very well with a kind of ELF perspective on how English language teaching should be approached. So I do think many teachers actually naturally do things which would fit in very well with an English as a lingua franca approach, but they perhaps haven't called it that and they haven't been aware of it before. But also, I think some teachers are beginning to be perhaps more explicit in the way that they approach English language teaching from a global Englishes or a world Englishes or an English as a lingua franca perspective. So this would be things like incorporating materials that are to do with English used around the world. So, for example, this might be, and I'm taking a real example here, a course for university students in Japan who are learning English, and the materials that they look at are not materials from the UK or the US, or certainly not exclusively. So, for example, they might look at news sites from, they might look at Al Jazeera, for example, or they might look at Chinese news site, they might look at news sites in Japan, they might look at news sites that come out of Germany. And there are many different news sites around the world that produce English language materials, either live broadcasting or web pages, etc., which are written in English but not by native speakers of English. And also, importantly, the cultural content is not set around the Anglophone cultures of the UK, the US. And I think more of that is happening, where teachers are consciously taking the decision to choose materials that do not just centre on the Anglophone world and do not just centre on Anglophone uses of English. So I think that's one really important step towards a kind of a more ELF-like approach to teaching English.
And another thing would be that, oh sorry, did you have more to say?
No, that's fine.
Another thing is that people are starting to take notice of is accommodation. You see more and more reference to, not necessarily the term accommodation, it's a very theoretical term, but the need to be able to adjust your speech. So this is becoming, starting to be mentioned in materials, and certainly on teacher training courses. So that would be part of it. I mean, you can't talk about teaching ELF as such, because ELF is not a thing. ELF is not a variety, so you can't actually teach ELF as a variety, but you can teach ELF aware. ELF aware. You can have ELF aware teaching, ELF informal teaching, by including the sorts of things Will has talked about: accommodation skills, adjusting skills. Also familiarity, making people very familiar. Another thing that Will has mentioned. And in that sense, we have a question from Susan, who's just asked, isn't the key to a lot of this familiarity? I mean, some people are more used to hearing a certain type of English rather than another. And that's absolutely true, I think, that it's much easier to understand people when you're familiar with the way they speak English. So, for example, I had, in my project, I had a Chinese student who talked about when he first arrived at the university, and he found it very difficult to communicate with a particular Greek student. But he said, I spent a lot of time with this guy, and very quickly I learnt to understand the way he speaks English. So, you know, Susan's point about familiarity, I think, is a very important one, and is one that needs to be incorporated in English language teaching. And instead of just playing maybe recordings of native speakers and maybe just a few, maybe an occasional Italian or something, but actually bringing in lots of ways of speaking from all around the world. And I think at the moment, particularly from East Asia, which has the largest number of ELF users, as far as I know. I don't know if others would like to come in now on the familiarity question. No.
Well, I was just going to add, I mean, the comment about East Asia, I thought you were going to take that up, but I'll start anyway. I think that's a really important point, because, of course, you have to remember that English is not just a language of the Anglophone world. It's the official working language of ASEAN, which is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So that means a large proportion of Southeast Asia uses English to communicate with themselves, and at an official level as well. So if you have an ASEAN meeting, which for those of you familiar with Europe is very similar to an EU meeting, the language that will be used there is English. Now, very few of those people would have English as their first language, but it's still an official language. So we need to recognise that English is, you know, it's a big language in various other places, not just for native speakers and not just in the Anglophone world. And I think, I mean, in China, it's taking on an even greater role. But I think Ian can maybe say more about that.
Yeah. So actually, just at your point, actually, I think it's really important to make sure that students have their own choices of according to their own purposes, because actually while I was teaching in the concept of English as a lingua franca, I kept receiving questions, because actually now at the moment I'm teaching here in UK. So many students are challenging and say, okay, actually we're here, we want you to get integrated with the local community. Yeah, actually I think, yeah, that's fine, that's your choice. But it's really important for us to have the awareness of the equality among different Englishes, among different types of Englishes. So actually, if your purpose is to use English as a local language here, if you'd like to get integrated, yeah, of course you use native speakers English. But if the purpose is to communicate with people in intercultural communication, in intercultural settings, I think you need to actually adopt what Ware has said about accommodation and those adaptation and appropriation skills, so that your communication can be easier. And in terms of China, actually, this is very interesting. While I was giving a lecture in China talking about the concept of English as a lingua franca, and I always get a question. So how do native English speakers think of our English? So actually, I feel quite difficult to answer this question, because how to say, this question actually goes back to the ideology that native English speakers are gatekeepers of non-native English speakers English, because we actually need their approval so that we can feel confident in our own English. So actually, well, you were asking how native English speakers thinking about non-native English speakers English. Actually, this question goes back to the ideological issue. And in my own research, because my research relates to non-Chinese speakers' perspectives on their own English. And actually, I can say that Chinese speakers possibly are not so much, in general, from according to the data that I got, it seems that Chinese speakers are not so much worried about the conformity to native speakers English. And I can say, in some way, native English speakers English is cast in disparaging terms. So what they are worried about is whether they can get their business done, whether they can get their communication successful. So actually, they are not so much worried about native speakers' norms. But it's true for the students, university students, they're worried about being penalized if they cannot conform to native speakers English, because this is the situation, this is the status quo. And yeah, but the point that we need to make students aware of this concept is, once they leave the system, they are put in real situation when they need to use English. They feel more confident in their own way of using English. And actually, I see the difference between students who feel struggled between their desire to use English in their own way and the requirement that they need to use English in native speakers' way. So actually, I can see their struggle, and I see these students are different from other students who actually believe in the necessity to conform to native speakers' English. So actually, I can see the difference between those two groups of students. And actually, yeah, but I'm afraid I won't have much time to talk about this now. And it also relates to language policy. And actually, I found that in educational policy, and Chinese is highlighted, while English is not. So, and we also have the program of spreading Chinese around the world. So actually, there was lots of issues to be considered. So language policy, language attitude, and yeah. So whether we need to think about native speakers English is not. I mean, in the Chinese context, it's not so much highlighted, to be honest. So this actually gives me more confidence in doing research with Chinese speakers on English, and I do think possibly there is the future for Chinese speakers on English to be accepted. It is in process. There is some change here, ideologically and practically. So yeah.
Okay, I'd like to come in at that point because there are other questions that relate to things that Ing has just brought up. One of them is more to do with the future of English, so I'd like us to take that one at the end before we finish the discussion. But one of them relates to native speakers English, and Penelope, I'm not sure if it's the same Penelope as before, has asked, is it wrong for learners to aspire to nativeness? Is, in brackets, just intelligibility a reasonable target? So we've heard from Ing very much the view that actually non-native English speakers should not aspire to nativeness. I'm not sure if aspire is the right word. I don't think I'd use aspire because I wouldn't be using it as a hierarchical situation where native English is higher in that hierarchy than non-native English, because I would be always looking at who is the effective communicator in English in the context in which they're in, which most of the time is not a native English, an English as a foreign language context. But I wonder what the other two think about, my two colleagues think about whether it's actually wrong for non-native learners to want to acquire native-like English.
Well, I think for me it's crucial that learners are given a choice, but I think at the moment they're not given a proper choice because often they're unaware of the different uses of English that are out there and the different kinds of English and the different way that they can identify with English, and as Ing was saying, their own ownership of English, their own right to use English in their own way. So indeed, I mean, surveys tend to show that many learners, certainly not all, but many learners do aspire to a kind of native speaker English. But I think often that they haven't been given a choice. I mean, it's perhaps no surprise that so many do, given that English language learning materials are typically based around this idea of an Anglophone English and a kind of idealized native speaker English. So, you know, if you've been at school and you've had 10 years of that, 15 years of that, it's no wonder that when you're asked what kind of English you'd like to learn or you'd like to speak, then you say, oh yes, of course I would like native speaker English, or I'd like American English, or I'd like British English. But that's, I think, as much a result of the kind of teaching they've had as anything else. And in actual fact, they're often very unaware that there are other ways you can use English and they're just as legitimate. I mean, the other problem, of course, is what do you mean when we say native speaker English? Because as most people get a very rude shock when they arrive in the UK and discover that most people do not speak like their Headway textbook or their English file textbook, that actually there's a huge variety of English accents. And not just the accents, but the way people use the language is actually very, very different to the kind of language that's in English language teaching materials. English language teaching materials are very much an idealized form of English. I mean, I would argue they're not native speaker English at all. I don't speak like a textbook. I mean, I maybe speak a little bit more like a textbook when I'm trying to communicate with a large number of people, but certainly when I'm at home with my friends, I don't speak anything like an English language teaching textbook. So I don't think what people are actually taught is native English, first of all. And secondly, I think often when learners say that that's what they want to learn, it's because they're not aware of the choices that they can make. But I'd also say is that an increasing number of learners are choosing not to identify with native speaking English. I mean, over the last sort of 10 years or so, surveys have shown a much more kind of international orientation to English. So when you ask students why are they learning English, it's so they can join a kind of international community of one kind or another, not so that they can communicate with British people or American people or Australian people.
Yes, I mean, I think the issue of choice that you brought up, Will, is absolutely key. I think, you know, ELF researchers are often accused of wanting to remove choice, but we always point out that actually we're adding another choice because most learners of English are given no choice at all. They're either taught American English or they're taught British, a particular American kind of English or a particular British kind of English. but they're given no choice. You do get places where they are given a choice between American and British, but that's all. So saying that if they would prefer, they can follow an ELF route where they're being taught to be ELF aware rather than to mimic native English speakers of one type, I think is just adding a choice. And as Will said, increasingly younger people are getting interested in that choice and are taking it. But the crucial thing is that if people really do want to sound like a native English speaker, nobody would be stopping them. Certainly no ELF researcher or nobody who's involved in English as a lingua franca would stop them. I always used to say to learners when they said, oh, I want to speak native English, I said, well, which English person do you want to sound like? Because, you know, even in the school I first was teaching in many years ago, there were so many different types of English being spoken by the natives. And I've noticed in the comments over this week, I can't remember who made this comment. It may have been a Romanian person, but this Romanian person who made the comment talked about coming to the UK and went to Manchester and couldn't, you know, found the Manchester English very, very difficult to understand, and said, you know, would that be a kind of ELF, you know, because it's Manchester English. And it is as different from, say, the sort of as near RP, near received pronunciation standard type of English I speak. It's as different from that probably as a Romanian person's English is. So, you know, yes, it's fine if people want to learn to sound like a native English speaker, perhaps because they're going to be mixing with only or mainly native English speakers and they want to blend in and be treated as an equal, because attitudes come into this, which is, I hope, to fit in a question on attitudes, but that's very involved, and they know that the attitudes towards them of the native English speakers will be more positive if they sound more like them. But it has to be a personal choice. But as Will said, they really do have to be properly informed of the sort of situation, the global situation, and who speaks English and how many, you know, 2 billion people and more probably are users of English as a lingua franca. 350 million are native English speakers, 5 non-native English speakers to every 1 native. They need to know things like that. I don't know if anybody else, I don't know if Ing wants to come in.
Yeah, just a little bit to be added. And actually, I agree with this issue of language users' choice. But actually, it's also very interesting that many people are saying that, yes, we're happy with other people speaking non-native English speakers English, but for myself, I still want to speak native speakers English. But actually, yeah, it's absolutely your personal choice. But the point I'd like to make is, for many non-native English speakers, they had to spend loads and loads of time in order to sound like native speakers. Yeah, if you are happy to make those efforts, then that's fine. But for some people, they got other things to do. They got different priorities. And I mean, the point is, are they happy with their own English? Yes, if we have this target set as native speakers English, if we think this is your personal choice. But I mean, the point that I'd like to make is, when you can't speak native-like, are you happy with your own English? Actually, I think this is more important. And for many non-native English speakers, they just can't. I mean, yeah, possibly this is not absolute answer. I can't. Yeah. Of course, if you spend days and days trying to produce native-like sound, like what Jenny has talked about, you know, the sound, and yeah, possibly you can make that, but yeah, you also have to do a lot of other jobs. So actually, the point is, are you happy with your own English when you can't make native-like sound? So actually, the ideological issue goes with the point that are you celebrating the difference in Englishes? Are you really acknowledging, and are you really thinking non-native speakers English are all right, or they are equally beautiful as native speakers English. So actually, I think, yeah, you have your personal choice, but I still think it's important for us to celebrate diversity in English and also really give the space to non-native English speakers English. So yeah, this is, I mean, the ideological issue is always there. Although when we say, yeah, it sounds like easy, but I think it's quite difficult to. I mean, I went through this process, to be honest, but I hope the course can give us more food for thought, more things to be considered, and yeah. So this is what the point that I'm going to make. I really hope non-native English speakers can be really confident in their own way of using English, and they can focus on other jobs and focus on. I mean, they have other priorities, and do not just let the appropriation to native speakers English take so much time.
Yes, as one of the students in my study with 34 international students pointed out, he said, I have a lot of time I need to spend on my subject, on my university work. Why should I have to waste time making my English more like a native speaker's English? I agree entirely with the point you've just made, Ian. But I think we'll have to leave that topic now unless anybody is desperate to say more on it, because we're almost at the end. And I would like us to say a little bit about the future of English. And we've had a number of questions. Juliet asked, as English spreads, do you think the spelling of English will change? Points out we already have text, the spelling of text, you know, leaving out lots of vowels and so on, which many in the UK despair of, although a lot of it's logical. She says, will there be dictionaries full of alternative spellings for example, colour, with C-O-L-O-U-R, C-O-L-O-R, and K-O-L-O-R? But of course, it's not only about spelling. The future of English relates to all the linguistic levels and to what's actually going to happen in terms of who's speaking English and therefore how English will be spoken in relation to its users. I mean, Professor Christopher Brumfitt, who was at Southampton University, is often quoted. A very famous quote. I can't remember the exact words now, but I expect one of the others can. But it was more or less that, you know, that it's the users of a language who are responsible, or who have the authority to decide how it's used and how it's changed and so on. And in the case of English, he pointed out, and this was nearly 15 years ago he said this, there are actually many more non-native English users than native, and therefore it's the non-native who are going to be deciding on how English is used in the future. So is it going to become very much more influenced by non-native use? The other thing that people have asked about is, are there other international languages that are going to be going in the same direction as English? And also, are there languages that are threatened by the spread of English? That's quite a lot. We've got 1 minute left, I think, so we can't answer all this. But if each of you would like to just pick the bit that most interests you and say something fairly brief about it. Will, do you want to start?
Okay, yeah, well, I'll talk about the threat to other languages. And I think, I mean, there is a genuine worry out there that we're losing linguistic diversity. Languages, we talk about language death, where languages disappear. And this is something that is undoubtedly happening. And for many people interested in preserving many different kinds of language, this is not a good thing. But I think it's perhaps wrong to assume that that's just because of English, or because of any global language, actually. I mean, the reason that smaller languages disappear is usually to do with national languages. It's not to do with international languages. So when a country becomes unified, lots of smaller states become part of one state, then the national language tends to predominate, and it's the national language that's promoted through schooling, in business, in government, etc. And then that tends to mean that there's no role anymore for smaller languages. So I think it's false to equate that with English. But of course, it's much easier just to blame everything on the spread of English than to accept that actually there's more complex ideological and political issues behind that. So I'm going to be quick. So just to sum up, basically, I don't think English leads to the death of smaller languages. yeah, I think it's national languages rather than global languages that causes that.
Okay, and I don't know if Ian wants to say something about Chinese becoming a global language, or rather talk about something else.
So actually, I think this is not just. I mean, it is part of language policy thing in China. We do have the program of spreading Chinese around the world, and actually, I think this is not just a desire by the Chinese government. Is I mean, similar issues can be found in other countries, in France, for example. So actually, I mean, people. I mean, this is kind of a way for language for local different governments. They always see their mother tongues as important symbols of nations' cohesion, of national identity. So actually, for many countries, they wanted to have their own mother tongues to be influential. So actually, I think this is understandable. But it really depends on how many people are using this language. I mean, say Chinese or French or other languages as a second language. At the moment, we are happy that Chinese speakers are a lot. So actually, we've got a strong basis to sustain Chinese language. We have so many people around the world are using this language, so it is possible for this language to be influential in the future. But as I said, it really depends on how many people are using it as a second language. And currently, I think English is having this role. And yeah, I know. Yeah, Jenny is an expert in English, so possibly, yeah, you have something.
So I'll just take us back very quickly to English because we need to stop in a moment. Just to say that I think probably it will remain as English as the first global language for some time to come. I think it's going to get more and more diverse as more and more speakers from different countries start to use it. But I think it's also going to I think there's going to be more and more understanding of the importance of accommodation, of adjusting the way you speak. So I think this is going to be taught much more and people are going to get much better at it. I think as a result of this much greater diversity that Ying also talked about earlier, we're going to have much more sort of multilingualism involved in English. There's going to be much more switching around across languages with English as the sort of common language than there has been in the past. I mean, Alistair Pennycook, who's a very well-known sociolinguist, has talked about English as a translingua franca. And he thinks that, I mean, I think what he says is very similar to what English as a lingua franca is, but he talks about how, you know, other languages are always there in the background. I think also what's going to happen is that as more and more people around the world speak English, and they're not native English speakers, I think we're going to see the gradual disadvantaging of native English speakers if they are monolingual. They're going to often find themselves in situations where everybody else is speaking English and other languages, and they're the only ones that can speak only one. And on that happy note, I think we'd better end this. So I'd like to thank everyone who's participated this week, and also on the whole course. And thanks, really thanks for your interesting comments and all your stimulating questions. And sorry, we could have had 5 hours and still not answered all your questions. Before we say goodbye, there's just one more thing I'd like to say, which is that we do hope to see you in Southampton for our master's course in Global Englishes. All 3 of us will be taking part in the teaching of this course. So if you've enjoyed the week of Global Englishes, do join us for more and come and hear Ian talk much more about ideology, and we'll talk much more about intercultural communication and so on. But now I'm going to have to say goodbye. So I'm going to say goodbye myself and hand over to Will to say goodbye, and then Ian to say goodbye, and then maybe Kate would like to quickly say goodbye as well, if she can get to the...
Okay, well,
maybe.
Yes.
Maybe Kate first. Sorry.
Bye everyone. Thank you so much for your comments. I've been reading them on the chat window and they've been fascinating. Thank you. Bye bye.
Okay, Will.
Okay, well, bye-bye everyone, and again, thank you for the comments and the questions, and we hope to see some of you in Southampton.
And Ing.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, and I really hope to see you here. And by the way, actually, we have a lot of activities here in Southampton dealing with global English issue, and all of us, 3 of us, are going to Beijing for the 8th International Conference of English as a Lingua Franca, and actually I'm working on it as a member of organizing committee. So I mean, yeah, if you are studying here with Center for Global English, there are lots of opportunities and a lot of fun, actually. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.